Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Welcome to Season 5 of the show. I'm excited to share some news with you about the Queer Spirit Podcast community. Until now, we've had a private Facebook group for listeners and a separate Patreon group for backing supporters. As someone who values building queer community and keeping our queer spaces sacred, I've decided to merge and move both groups to a new private community on Mighty Networks. This new space is free from the distraction of advertisements and clickbait, where we can gather together in a virtual community of our own co-creation. There will also be more opportunities for live gatherings like meditation groups, support circles, and virtual sound baths, so stay tuned. To join us in our new space, go to queerspirit.mn.co. That's queerspirit.m as in Mary, N as in Nancy.co. You can also find the link in the show notes. Okay, now on with the show. My guest today is Eli Ramer. Eli, who writes under the name Andrew Ramer, is the author of several books of interest to gay and queer readers, including Queering the Text and Flutes Playing, which author and journalist Mark Thompson called a gay classic. Eli resides in Oakland, California. Today we discuss Eli's new book, Two Hearts Dancing, which is a companion piece to his classic, Two Flutes Playing. This leads into a conversation about the value of poems and stories in our wobbly world. We also chat about the role of queer folk in dealing with climate change. Find Eli and his work at andrewramer.com. That's Andrew, Ramer.com. Hi, Eli. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's a joy to be with you. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. I'm excited to have you here because you have a new book out, but I'm also just excited because you are my first return guest. So it'll be interesting to see how our conversation continues. But I wondered if we could start up by having you tell us a little bit about your new book that has just come out a few months ago called Two Hearts Dancing.
Thank you. I'm blushing a little. I didn't know that I was the first returnee, so I'm honored and delighted. And it's a joy to be with you, with your exquisite turquoise background shining through whatever multidimensional reality we live in. I think if I have any kind of reputation in the queer world, it's for a book that was initially published in 1991, Two Flutes Playing. And that book has gone through, I think, 5 different versions of publication until it's settled in a particular reality where I think it will stay in print. But the archetypal level of gay queerness that I was talking about is my contribution to this conversation. And when the book was done, I started working on what was becoming a book with a really dear friend from Atlanta, who is an amazing artist, Raven Wolf Dancer. And his life ended at someone else's hand before we finished the book. He was doing drawings, I was writing stories. Sometimes I'd write a story, he'd do the drawing. Sometimes he'd send me a drawing. Woo! It's like, I know the story for that. So I desktop published a kind of version of it and sold 300 copies. And then I forgot about it for decades. And when COVID came in fire season in California, I started, because I was trapped in the house for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, going through all of my unpublished material, organizing it, thinking, well, I may die any day. At least I don't want to leave a mess for whoever finds my stuff. And I came upon that book called Stories of Our People. I sent it to the publisher and they said, sorry, too little. So I started going through all of my unpublished gay stories, poems, essays, and crafted a second section to it. So the first part is called Stories of Our People, which is what I did with Raven. And the second part is called Poems for Our Tribe. And sent it to the publisher, and they liked it. The magic of it, there's many pieces of magic to it, but when I first finished Two Flutes Playing, I made 4 copies. I went to a copy center. I made 4 copies. I gave them to 4 people. One of them went to my friend Michael Starkman, who gave it to a friend of his, who gave it to Joe Kramer, the founder of the Body Electric School. And Joe is the one who published, thank you, Joe, the first edition of it. So what's magically marvelous now is that the art on the cover of Two Hearts Dancing was done by Michael Starkman. Thank you, Michael. So we've kind of come full circle in many ways.
Wow. I don't know if you mentioned the Joe Kramer connection last time you were on the show and we talked about that, but that's really cool to hear because I imagine a lot of people listening might have heard of Body Electric and know about him. So
I hope so. Yeah, it was an incredible gift to our community and rippled out to way broader communities.
Yeah. Before we get too far away from the book, I wonder if you want to read a short selection for our listeners to get a sample.
Okay. Let's see. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned something that I think I wrote in around 1975. So I'll read 2 very little things, if I can find it. So this is called 4 Categories of Men. He isn't a god, and he cannot dance. He isn't a god, but he dances. He is a god, but he cannot dance. He is a god, and oh, the way he dances.
Yes, I love that one.
Anything else you liked?
I didn't get too far into the poetry part, more into the short stories. So whatever you feel called to read.
Okay, I'll read one other short one. It's called Time. Eugene is waiting for Tom. Tom is waiting for Jose. Jose is waiting for Howard. Howard is still waiting for Kenji. Kenji is waiting to finish his dissertation. Carlos is waiting for Tomas. Tomas is waiting for Sebastian. Sebastian is waiting for Renshu. Renshu is waiting for Vincent. Vincent is waiting for Walid. Walid is waiting for his 30th birthday. Time waits for no man.
I think that poem encapsulates what we sometimes call gay standard time.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you for reading that. So I know you've talked a little bit about how poems and stories are important and valuable in our wobbly times. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what that means for you.
Thank you. It means for me 2 things. One is that stories, poems, when they're told, anchor us in humanity. I picture, whatever the time of day and wherever we are, even if you're reading a book, that at the deepest internal level, it's nighttime and we're sitting around a campfire. And maybe it's 200,000 years ago. And I have this kind of theory that the original human language was actually signs. It was all digital. And there's some evidence. Children who were taught sign become fluent about 6 months before children who were taught verbal speech. That signing is encoded at a deeper level in our brain. So my theory is that people, as we started to evolve to become human, connected with each other and built community through stories. And that somebody started to invent, out of grunts and groans and sounds, spoken language so that we could tell more stories when it was dark. It's very hard in the darkness, if you haven't invented fire yet and there isn't a full moon, to see someone signing their story. And so I feel like when we tell a story, even to this day, if it is signed, we're anchoring ourselves in human history and we're grounded in archetype in the most basic level. And in wobbly times, we need all the grounding we can get. We're facing what some people call climate extinction, which you and I have talked about a bit. How are we going to get through that? If we can get through that is by building community. And I think what builds community is stories, shared stories, told stories, dance stories, song stories, sign stories. So for me, it's essential. It's the food for the soul. a story, the way that we utterly need food for the body.
Yeah, so I'm curious about this word wobbly. I mean, I definitely feel like we're especially in wobbly times right now, but what does wobbly mean for you?
Wobbly, for me, is rippling circles of personally all the illness and death around me. Wrapped around that, COVID and what that's doing to the planet. And then wrapped around that, climate change and the possibility of climate extinction. So I don't like to use military metaphors, but I see this as a kind of a bullseye and a target. There's the center, is what's happening to each of us individually, wrapped around the cultural shifts, and then wrapped around what's going on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And playing devil's advocate, I would say that, it's possible that times might always be wobbly. Maybe we're just not seeing it, and wobbly doesn't always have to be bad. It can just be movement and change. And I think that maybe our culture has been a little stagnant for too long, and this wobbliness is maybe needed.
Well, I hope you're finding evidence of that in your work and in your friendship and family and communities. But I think what makes it shift a little bit is, well, we live on a planet that wobbles on its axis. Some planets, I think, have way more stable axes than we do. I like some wobble. It adds to the energy of a really good dance. But what some people are calling the Sixth Extinction is what we're looking at.
Yeah. It's getting a little too wobbly.
It's getting a little too wobbly. And, I grew up in a world and a family where all of my grandparents were immigrants fleeing from pogroms and anti-Semitism, and some of my extended family, came here, escaping from the Holocaust. And so I'm not oblivious to wobble all through human history. And I started out my journey in college to be an archaeologist. I'm fascinated with the deepest levels of history. There's always been wobble. But even in times of famine, war, plague, when people at every level were threatened, I don't think there ever has been a time before where all of human life was threatened. And so for me, what this brings up is this a different wobble. And for me, what this brings up are things that you and I have talked about, which is, what is the role of gay and queer people in this time of heightened wobble?
Yeah. So tell us more about your thoughts about that, our role during this particularly wobbly time.
Well, some of who we are, and my focus as someone who is almost 71, in some ways in the bigger queer world, is more focused on gay male communities and culture. But what I see is, and what I talk about in one of the early stories in Two Hearts Dancing, is that we come from every other people. We appear all over the world. Some of us do have gay and queer parents, but most of us don't. And even those of us who are gay and queer and have kids may have unqueer kids in a queer in a narrower way. But something that I noticed as a very young man, which I see has changed a little bit since mobile phones came, but certainly in the past, two gay men walking down the street in a completely strange city caught each other's eye. There were ways that we found each other and connected and met, even if we did not speak the same language. And this, to me, is part of our power in a changing, threatened world. The UN has estimated by the year 2050, there will be 1 billion climate refugees escaping from rising water, from drought, from flooding, from all of the other changes that may come with climate change. Who's going to hold all those refugee communities together? So my theory is it's going to be queer people. There are going to be, 50,000 people crammed into an enormous refugee camp, speaking different languages, coming from different cultures, with histories of hostility, with absolute terror, wanting to take whatever little bit of food there is from each other. Who's going to hold us together? my feeling is that this is the time where queer gay people need to start to train ourselves to be in dialogue with each other, to communicate with each other, to work with each other, to recognize the absolute shared destiny of humankind in a way that we've never had to do before. Mm-hmm. So this for me is really an outgrowth of who we are as other, and an outgrowth of archetypal power of recognition and deep, deep, deep embodied soul connection.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting as you talk about this, it makes me think about the idea of quote unquote gay or queer community and the way that that experience has evolved over the last couple of years. And, you know, I think about, you know, gay and queer people of your generation who really had a strong, at least what I think was a strong experience of queer community. And then someone, you know, my age who's, you know, almost 30 years younger than you, and hearing people talk about gay community or queer community, but never really having the experience of it, and thinking about how, you know, why is that and what has changed, and the way that gay people and queer people as groups and communities have not needed to gather together so much because it's safer in many areas and there's more of us, so it's not so tightly knit. You know, when you have a smaller piece of fabric, can we say, it'll be more tightly knit. But if you have a larger piece of fabric, it can be more loose, right? And so, you know, the experience of community feels looser, I guess, to me, I guess I'll say. And then beyond that, I think about the ways that queer people don't connect and don't see eye to eye, and the ways that, you know, here in the United States, the conservative right has co-opted queerness to sort of say, well, yeah, you know, like, you know, Trump going to rallies and saying he supports the gay community and the queer community, and there being gay Republicans and that kind of thing. And there actually being queer people who identify with that, but don't see the fact that these politicians are sort of tearing our community apart in certain ways based on the laws that they're passing and that kind of thing. And so I don't have a question. I'm just sort of musing out loud about what I'm thinking about as you share that, and how I do think it's important, and I agree with you, for us to come back to, you know, how important it is for us to communicate with each other and see where we have our, you know, what we share with each other, which is really just humanity, and which is really what I think everyone, whether or not they're queer or cisgender or heterosexual or whatever it may be, to see our humanity. And there's so many ways that the powers that be don't want us to see other people in their humanity.
It's hard because we're a fairly new species and our brains are still evolving. And in some ways, we still have sort of biologically programmed us, them primate brains. And if we're going to survive, I think we have to get to the next step, which is really hard. So how do we, as queer people in one part of the spectrum, look at queer people, you know, that you referenced, who are Trump supporters, who have politics that, you know, I don't understand? How do we stop, even if we're looking at a queer right-wing Republican, and say, I don't agree with you and you don't agree with me, but we actually both are really passionate about the world, so we share passion. I don't agree with you and you don't agree with me, but we both want this to be a better world, so we agree on that level of vision. How do we start to organize our primate brains to look for common ground in different places? You're pro-life, I'm pro-choice. We care about people, happiness, well-being, even though we don't agree. That's not a place that we go to. And I feel that one of the powers of the queer community is that we're kind of like a smaller laboratory for people learning to cooperate. Because in that refugee camp, where maybe 35 different languages will be spoken, and there's barely enough food to give one meal a day to every one of those people, where's the common ground going to come from? Isn't going to come from any of the categories that we know, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or whatever your culture is or your background or your faith. It's not going to matter anymore in the way that it has. And so I feel like we have to come up with common ground. I care, you care. Can we hold that in a tender place in our hearts? We're not there yet.
I listened to our first interview yesterday in preparation for this one, just to sort of see what we talked about then. And, we talked about this idea of consciousness scouts, and I'm thinking about this idea of these queer people being in these camps, sort of wandering around, being consciousness scouts and, using our gaydar to seek each other out, to connect. And we did, even in that interview, we talked a lot about community and connection. And we also talked about solitude, which I think is interesting, given what has transpired in the last couple years since our last interview with COVID and quarantine and everything. And I'm curious if your experience of hermitage or solitude versus community has shifted at all, or your ideas about it have shifted at all since we've gone through this experience in the last couple years.
Great question, Nick. In several ways it has. I have this fantasy that 20 years from now, some of us who are still alive, who are alive now, are going to look back and say, oh my God, remember how wonderful it was in COVID? Like how safe and wonderful the world felt back then, because the world may be way more dangerous. Like living in Northern California in fire season where you can't breathe the air is not the whole planet. But in 2050, it may be that no one can go outside because the air has become so toxic from air pollution. And we'll look back and think, oh gosh, it was so nice then when the fires weren't raging, which wasn't all year. You could go for walks and, remember those little thin masks and how wonderful they were, because now you have to wear this like big, breathing device just to go outside. So we may look back in a funny way at this time as a gift on that level, and also on the level that we probably would have never met, you and I, this way on and through technology. And the other piece that may hold humanity together when there are 1 billion climate refugees is technology. That families who are separated will be able to find each other, that meetings may be held together. It's entirely possible that government, councils, even the entire refugee camp may all be meeting on the great-great-great-grandchild of Zoom or some platform like that. And we'll look back and our elders will say, we wouldn't be able to survive if it wasn't for what we learned in COVID. And some of you are too young and you don't even know what COVID is, the way that, I've had students who kind of know what the Holocaust was. They may have heard of the Vietnam War. They don't know about the civil rights movement very much. So people may look back and have to say to their grandchildren, once upon a time, there was a pandemic. It was such a lovely time. It brought us together in amazing ways, even though it also seemed in a kind of paradoxical yin-yang sort of a way to be really painful. We would not be able to survive if it wasn't for COVID. And I'm looking at COVID through the lessons that I learned having survived the height of AIDS, which was in some ways, we didn't use the word queer. At least I didn't use the word queer. No one in my communities did. And our model was very binary, gay and lesbian. And often in the places I lived, gay men and lesbians didn't talk a whole lot. We were in very separate communities. I was one of those odd wanderers. I think I once told you the story how I was dubbed an honorary lesbian in the 70s. That was one of the high points of my whole life, to be, dubbed with a very large wooden spoon by amazing writer and poet Joan Larkin in a room with Audre Lorde and June Jordan. I now dub thee an honorary lesbian. So I was on the edge of wandering, but there was a big separation till AIDS came. And what happened, which I think has made the queer community as we know it possible, that might not have happened without AIDS, is that our lesbian sisters, and I will cry, showed up to hold us and support us, to lobby for us, to march for us, to nurse us, care for us, hold our hands, and create a different kind of gay lesbian community that in the next generation started to be bigger. Suddenly there was LGB, then there was LGBT, then there was this addition of other things that might not have happened. As a sometimes fantasy writer, I can imagine that if we didn't have AIDS, that gay men and lesbians might have gone in very different directions and not come together. We'll never know that, but it's one of the horrible gifts of a heartbreaking time is that kind of community and the way that lesbians showed up for men who were dying and holding their lovers who were dying and their friends.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the role that all queer people have the possibility to embody and manifest as things may get worse on this planet.
So just coming back to this idea of solitude and staying at home, you also mentioned being at a conference, and I think you said it was a Hopi elder who talked about staying at home and make your own beauty at home. And I can definitely say that, this quarantine has given us this gift of you staying at home and making this beauty of this book for us. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
So before we wrap up, I wonder if you want to read one more piece from your book to close us out.
Okay, how long do I have?
You've got a couple minutes if you want to read something longer.
Let's see. Okay. So while I'm looking for, this is one of my favorite stories. So what have you learned from Solitude?
What have I learned from Solitude? Well, my experience of the pandemic wasn't too different because I'm a little bit of a hermit sometimes anyway. And also because of my work, it hasn't really changed much. I didn't really stop working as a therapist. I actually got busier. And the only thing that really changed was instead of meeting my clients in person, I met them online. But other than that, yeah, I mean, once we got settled into the groove of it, after the first couple months, my life didn't change a whole lot in terms of that. I just sort of went out less. But it gave me a chance to make my own beauty with music, which is something I've been working on over the last year with my sound healing and sound bath work. So there you go.
Yes, I've gone to several of those, and they are deliciously comforting and transformative. And so those of you who are listening who are younger, pay attention, because in 2050, when 1 billion of us are living in refugee camps, we're going to need a lot of sound healing. So I'm going to read something that's grounded in ancient Mesopotamian stories. And as I said, I set out when I went off to college to become an archaeologist. So this is one of my favorite stories, and it's grounded in just what I said, old Mesopotamian tales that go off in a somewhat different direction. So it's called Song of the Great God Dimawati to his beloved Nimue. Sung in the cities of Umuru, in the streets and taverns, sung to string and wooden flutes. This is the love song the great god Dimawati sang to his beloved Nimue, sung to flutes and ringing instruments in the cities of Umuru, in the house of his beloved Nimue. It is I who sing, the great god Dimawati, who descended from the heavens to take on flesh. It is I who sing now, Dimawati, ruler of Namuru, come from heaven. Great is my name among the people. Loudly they praise me, Dimawati, 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 ruler of the city and master of the sea. 10,000 sheep they bring me, rams, ewes, bound, unblemished. Sheep they bring me, cattle and unguents and spices they bring. Woven cloths, precious stones to my house, my temple, great house of Dimawati, doors covered with gold whose towers shine high above the city. It is I who created the cities. It is I who made the canals, built high the gates and walls, took on flesh to walk among the people, took on flesh to dance with you, Nimue, Nimue, son of Belitu, Belitu, the princess of the mountains. Your lips I took on flesh to meet, your limbs rubbed smooth with scented oils. Gentle, you reached a trembling hand to me, and we danced together in the moonlight. And I held you and rocked you in the night in your bed while the oil lamps flickered. Yes, I came down and stayed. I came down from the heavens and I stayed with you. I took on flesh. I descended from the clouds. I took on flesh to answer the call of one who already loved me. Yes, I came down. I came down from on high, from the house of our holy mother sky. I took on flesh. I came to your house, Nimue. I came to your bed. And this is the song that I sing. This is the love song of the god Dimawadi. This is the song the great god sings to the sound of golden flutes in my garden, standing beneath the vines, having come here to love, come here to dance, come here to sing to you, Nimue, son of Belitu, noble princess of the mountains, beloved of the great god Dimawadi, first of the gods to walk on earth. Yes, this is the song I sing to you, Nimue, son of Belitu, in the city of Umuru, in our garden on the morning of our wedding.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a blessing to spend time with you, Nick, and with all of you out there. Thank you.
So, Andrew, where can people find you and find your writing?
I have several names, can be found online. The book comes from the usual suspects like Amazon, but I love to say to people to go directly to the publisher and order it. And the publisher of this and Two Flutes Playing is called WIPF, WIPF, and Stock, STOCK. So wipfandstock.com. They have all kinds of amazing books, but you can get Two Hearts Dancing and Two Flutes Playing there.
And do you want to share your website in case people want to find more about you there too?
It's what I write under, so it's andrewramer.com.
Okay, great. I realize I just referred to you as Andrew and you like to go by Eli, so I'm still getting used to that. But thank you, Eli, for being here. It was a pleasure to have you back again.
Thank you, Nick, for this wonderful welcome and this wonderful conversation. So blessings to you and to everyone who is part of your community. You're doing such important work. And in 2050, people will be sitting around in refugee camps and say, I used to listen to these podcasts from this man, I think it was Rick, Nick, Blick, changed my life. So thank you.
Thank you. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by following the show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be well.